In 1934, a team of restoration workers opened a sealed chamber beneath France's Château de Vincennes and unleashed something no one could explain. From the darkness emerged not wind, not stone, but voices, dozens of them, screaming in dead languages, pleading from the depths of a royal oubliette designed for eternal torment. For centuries, this pit wasn't just a prison, it was a tool of psychological warfare, where victims vanished without a trace. But what if they never truly left? What they uncovered next would shake historians and scientists to their core. Comment: if you believe some places never forget, like if this story haunted you. And subscribe for more terrifying truths from history. The stone lid scraped against ancient mortar as they lifted it for the first time in 3 centuries. And immediately, the workers stepped back in horror as a sound emerged from the depths that chilled their blood and stopped their hearts. It was not the wind whistling through forgotten passages, nor the settling of old stones that had witnessed too much history. It was unmistakably human voices, crying out in languages long dead, speaking words of desperation that seemed to rise from the very bowels of hell itself. The year was 1934, and restoration work at the Château de Vincennes had uncovered something that French authorities would spend decades trying to explain away. Something so disturbing that even hardened archaeologists refused to descend into the darkness that had swallowed the screams of the forgotten for over 300 years. The morning when the restoration workers first opened the Oubliette began like any other day in the long process of renovating France's most historically significant fortress. The crew had been tasked with clearing debris from areas of the chateau that had been sealed since the French Revolution, when Republican authorities had ordered the closure of all spaces associated with royal torture and execution. Master craftsman Pierre Dubois had been supervising the removal of rubble from what appeared to be a forgotten storage chamber, when his crowbar struck the edge of a massive stone lid that had been concealed beneath centuries of accumulated debris and deliberately forgotten by those who had sealed it. The sound that emerged when the lid was lifted defied every natural explanation that the workers could conceive. It was not a single voice, but a chorus, dozens of distinct human voices speaking simultaneously, in a cacophony of despair that seemed to pour from the earth itself like water from a spring. Some voices spoke in medieval French, others in Latin, and still others in languages that the workers could not identify, but which conveyed emotions so raw and desperate that understanding the words was unnecessary. The voices overlapped and intertwined, creating a symphony of suffering that had apparently been preserved in the stone depths for centuries, waiting for someone to lift the lid and release their eternal lament into the world above. The immediate reaction of the restoration crew was pure terror, but as professional craftsmen who had worked on historical sites throughout France, they quickly attempted to find rational explanations for what they were experiencing. Perhaps it was merely the sound of wind moving through underground passages, they told themselves, or the acoustic effects of water flowing through hidden chambers deep beneath the chateau. But, as they listened more carefully, the human qualities of the sounds became undeniable. These were voices speaking recognizable words, expressing coherent thoughts, pleading for mercy and forgiveness in tones that no natural phenomenon could possibly produce. The Oubliette of Vincennes was not merely a prison, but a carefully designed instrument of psychological torture that represented the absolute worst of royal cruelty disguised as justice. The French word oubliette comes from the verb oublier, meaning to forget. And that was precisely its purpose, to make people disappear from the world of the living without the messy publicity of executions or the political complications of formal trials. The well descended 60 feet straight down through solid limestone, its walls so perfectly smooth that escape was impossible even for those with superhuman strength and determination. At the bottom, a chamber barely large enough for a man to lie down had been carved from the living rock, designed not for habitation but for the slow destruction of human sanity and the gradual dissolution of hope itself. The engineering of the Oubliette represented a level of calculated cruelty that even experienced historians found difficult to comprehend. Every aspect of its construction had been designed to maximize psychological suffering while minimizing the possibility of escape or rescue. The smooth limestone walls offered no handholds or footholds that might allow a prisoner to climb toward freedom, while the narrow diameter of the shaft ensured that no rope or ladder could be lowered without the knowledge and cooperation of the guards above. The depth of 60 feet was specifically chosen to place prisoners beyond the reach of any voice or sound from the outside world, creating a sensory isolation so complete that many victims lost their sanity long before they lost their lives. The chamber at the bottom of the Oubliette was perhaps the most diabolic feature of the entire construction. Barely large enough for a single person to lie down, it forced prisoners into a state of constant physical discomfort that made sleep nearly impossible and gradually wore down their physical and mental resistance. The walls of the chamber were carved with religious imagery and biblical quotations, a cruel mockery that reminded prisoners that God was aware of their suffering but had apparently chosen to allow it to continue. Iron rings embedded in the walls allowed guards to chain particularly dangerous or important prisoners, ensuring that even in their final refuge of madness, they could not escape the physical reminders of their captivity. King Louis XV, known to history as the Spider King for his web of conspiracies and political machinations, had commissioned the construction of this particular oubliette in 1470 as his personal solution to the problem of enemies who were too dangerous to release but too well connected to execute publicly. Louis was a man whose paranoia bordered on madness, who saw traitors in every shadow and conspiracies in every whispered conversation. He understood that public executions created martyrs and political complications, but people who simply vanished into the earth left behind only questions and fear. The oubliette at Vincennes became his preferred method of dealing with those who crossed him, a place where inconvenient people could be made to not exist without any of the political fallout that came with more conventional forms of royal justice. The psychological profile of Louis XV reveals a monarch whose fears and insecurities drove him to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of eliminating threats to his power. Unlike his predecessors, who had relied primarily on public displays of royal justice to maintain order, Louis understood that terror could be more effectively deployed through uncertainty and disappearance than through spectacle and ceremony. The oubliette allowed him to remove enemies from the political equation without creating the martyrs and revenge cycles that often resulted from public executions, while the mystery surrounding the fate of those who vanished served as a powerful deterrent to potential opposition. The construction of the oubliette required the services of master engineers and craftsmen who were sworn to secrecy about their work, and historical records suggest that many of these builders met suspicious ends shortly after completing their assignments. Louis XV was notorious for his practice of eliminating anyone who possessed dangerous knowledge about his methods and secrets, and the builders of the oubliette certainly qualified as holders of information that could potentially embarrass or threaten the crown. The technical specifications of the torture chamber were so precise and sophisticated that they clearly required extensive planning and expertise, suggesting that Louis had been contemplating this form of punishment for years before finally commissioning its construction. The first victim, whose name we know, was Cardinal Jean Balue, a man who had served Louis faithfully for years before making the fatal mistake of opening secret negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy. Balue was a scholar and diplomat, a man of refined tastes who had grown accustomed to the luxuries of court life and the respect that came with high ecclesiastical office. When Louis discovered his betrayal in 1469, the king's revenge was swift and merciless. Balue was arrested during a council meeting, dragged from the palace in chains, and thrown into the oubliette with no trial, no ceremony, and no opportunity to defend himself. The cardinal's screams echoed up from the depths for days, growing weaker and more desperate as hunger and thirst began their inevitable work on his pampered body. Cardinal Balue's background made his fall from grace particularly dramatic and served as a powerful example to other courtiers of how quickly royal favor could turn to royal wrath. Balue had been one of Louis XV's most trusted advisors, a man who had helped negotiate treaties, manage diplomatic correspondence, and served as an intermediary between the French court and the Vatican. His education and intelligence had made him invaluable to a king who prized cunning and political sophistication above martial valor or noble lineage. But these same qualities that had made Balue useful also made his betrayal particularly dangerous, as his knowledge of French diplomatic secrets and his connections to foreign powers posed a serious threat to Louis's security. The discovery of Balue's secret negotiations with Burgundy revealed the extent to which the cardinal had been playing a double game, using his position in the French court to gather intelligence that he then passed to Louis's enemies. The correspondence that Louis's spies intercepted, showed that Ballou had been providing detailed information about French military preparations, financial resources, and political vulnerabilities to Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy, who was then using this intelligence to plan military campaigns against French territory. The betrayal was not merely personal, but strategic, threatening the security of the entire kingdom and potentially costing thousands of French lives in the wars that would inevitably result from Burgundian knowledge of French weaknesses. But Ballou's fate was merciful compared to what befell those who came after him. The cardinal was eventually pulled from the pit after 11 years, more dead than alive but still technically breathing, released only because his influential friends in Rome had finally pressured the Vatican to intervene. Most of those who descended into the Oubliette were not so fortunate. They disappeared completely, their names erased from court records, their families told they had died of sudden illness or departed on secret missions for the crown. The truth was far more horrifying. They were still alive in the darkness below, slowly starving to death while their minds gradually disintegrated from the combination of isolation, terror, and the hopelessness that comes from knowing that the world above has forgotten you completely. The process by which prisoners in the Oubliette were systematically broken down represented a form of psychological warfare that was far more sophisticated than the crude physical tortures employed by most medieval rulers. The combination of sensory deprivation, social isolation, and the constant uncertainty about when or whether death would come created a psychological pressure that few human minds could withstand for extended periods. Prisoners were denied not only physical comfort, but also the basic human need for communication and social contact, forcing them to confront their own mortality and guilt in an environment where madness became a mercy rather than a curse. The feeding schedule for Oubliette prisoners was carefully calibrated to maintain them in a state of constant weakness while preserving their consciousness long enough to maximize their psychological suffering. Food and water were lowered into the pit irregularly, sometimes daily, sometimes not for weeks, creating a pattern of false hope and crushing disappointment that gradually destroyed the prisoners' ability to maintain rational thought. The guards who supervised these feedings were specifically instructed never to speak to the prisoners or acknowledge their pleas for information about their fate, maintaining the complete social isolation that was essential to the psychological torture. The psychological torture of the Oubliette was far more sophisticated than simple imprisonment. Prisoners were fed just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to satisfy their hunger, creating a state of constant physical weakness that made escape attempts impossible while keeping them conscious enough to fully experience their suffering. Water was provided irregularly, sometimes daily, sometimes not for weeks, creating a psychological pattern of hope and despair that destroyed the mind more effectively than any physical torture. The walls of the chamber were carved with religious scenes and biblical quotations, a cruel mockery that reminded the prisoners that God was watching their suffering but apparently had no intention of ending it. The religious imagery carved into the walls of the Oubliette chamber served multiple psychological purposes beyond simple mockery of the prisoner's faith. The scenes depicted various biblical punishments and divine judgments, from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to the sufferings of Job, creating a theological framework that suggested the prisoner's torment was not merely political punishment, but divine retribution for their sins. This religious context was particularly devastating for medieval prisoners, whose worldview was fundamentally shaped by Christian concepts of sin, judgment, and eternal damnation. The implication that their suffering was ordained by God himself often proved more psychologically destructive than the physical deprivations they endured. The biblical quotations carved into the stone were specifically chosen to emphasize themes of abandonment, despair, and divine wrath. Passages from the Psalms describing the complaints of the righteous, who felt forsaken by God. Verses from Job questioning divine justice in the face of inexplicable suffering, and selections from the prophetic books describing the punishments awaiting the wicked, created a theological environment that reinforced the prisoner's sense of hopelessness and spiritual isolation. For educated prisoners like Cardinal Ballou, who could read Latin and understand the full implications of these biblical references, the religious decorations became an additional form of intellectual torture that attacked their faith as well as their sanity. The acoustics of the well were perhaps its most diabolical feature. The limestone walls and the perfect cylindrical shape created a resonance chamber that amplified every sound from below while trapping it within the stone walls above. Prisoners could hear each other crying, praying, cursing, and slowly going mad, but they could never communicate effectively or offer each other comfort. The sounds of death were particularly horrible. The final rattling breaths of those who succumbed to starvation or disease echoed up from the depths like some infernal music that tormented the living while welcoming the dying into whatever darkness waited beyond life. The acoustic properties of the oubliette were so precisely engineered that modern sound experts who have studied the structure believe it was deliberately designed to create specific psychological effects through sound manipulation. The cylindrical shape and smooth walls created a resonance chamber that could transform whispers into roars and sobs into screams, while the depth of the shaft created echo effects that made it impossible for prisoners to accurately judge distances or locate the sources of sounds. This acoustic distortion contributed to the disorientation and madness that afflicted oubliette prisoners, as their ability to process auditory information became increasingly unreliable. The psychological impact of hearing other prisoners die was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the oubliette's acoustic design. The sound of death throes, final prayers, and desperate pleas for mercy created a constant reminder of the fate that awaited all who descended into the pit, while the echo effects made it impossible to determine how many other prisoners were present or whether the sounds were coming from the living or merely reverberating from previous deaths. This uncertainty about the source and meaning of the sounds they heard drove many prisoners to madness long before physical deprivation claimed their lives. Records from the period suggest that at least 40 people disappeared into the oubliette during Louis XV's reign, though the true number was likely much higher. These were not common criminals or obvious traitors, but people whose only crime was inconveniencing the king at the wrong moment, or possessing information that Louis wanted erased along with its bearer. Marie de Clèves, a lady-in-waiting who had overheard a conversation about the king's illegitimate children, vanished one winter morning and was never seen again. Jacques de Nemours, a minor noble who had questioned one of Louis's tax policies too publicly, disappeared from his estate and was officially recorded as having died of a fever, though his body was never found and no witnesses to his illness ever came forward. The case of Marie de Clèves illustrates the arbitrary and paranoid nature of Louis XV's use of the oubliette as a tool of political control. Marie was a young woman of noble birth who had served in the royal household for several years without incident, earning a reputation for discretion and loyalty that had made her a trusted member of the Queen's inner circle. Her fatal mistake was being present during a private conversation between Louis and his confessor about the king's extramarital affairs and the illegitimate children he had fathered with various court ladies. The information she overheard was politically sensitive because it could potentially be used by Louis's enemies to challenge the legitimacy of the royal succession or to blackmail the king into making political concessions. Marie's disappearance was managed with the same careful attention to plausible deniability that characterized all of Louis XV's uses of the oubliette. She was reported to have received urgent news about a family emergency that required her immediate departure from court, and official records showed that she had been granted leave to visit her ailing father in Normandy. When inquiries were eventually made about her whereabouts, court officials produced forged letters indicating that she had decided to enter a convent rather than return to court life, a decision that was presented as perfectly reasonable for a young woman of her religious disposition. The truth, known only to Louis and his most trusted executioners, was that Marie had been drugged during her evening meal and thrown into the oubliette while unconscious, ensuring that her screams would not alert other members of the household to her fate. Jacques de Nemours represented a different category of oubliette victim, the political opponent, whose influence had grown large enough to threaten the king's policies, but who had not yet committed any acts that could be construed as outright treason. Jacques was a provincial noble who had used his position in the regional parliament to organize opposition to Louis XV's increasingly heavy taxation of the nobility, arguing that the king's financial demands were destroying the economic foundation of the feudal system and threatening the traditional rights of the noble class. His speeches and written pamphlets had gained significant support among the provincial nobility, creating the potential for organized resistance to royal authority that Louis could not ignore. The elimination of Jacques de Nemours required more elaborate preparation than the disposal of a court lady who had overheard sensitive information. Jacques was a public figure whose sudden disappearance would attract attention and potentially create the kind of martyrdom that Louis was trying to avoid through his use of the oubliette. The solution was to stage an elaborate charade involving a supposed outbreak of plague at Jacques' estate, complete with forged medical reports and testimony from bribed physicians who swore that the noble had died of the disease, along with several members of his household. The supposed plague outbreak also provided justification for the immediate burial of the bodies and the quarantine of the estate, preventing anyone from investigating too closely or demanding to see physical evidence of the deaths. The most horrifying aspect of the oubliette was not the deaths it caused, but the living torture it inflicted on those who survived. When Cardinal Ballieu was finally released after 11 years, he was no longer recognizably human. His hair had turned completely white, his body was emaciated beyond recognition, and his mind had been so thoroughly broken that he spoke only in whispers and could not tolerate being in rooms with other people. He lived for another 7 years after his release, but those who knew him said he was merely a walking corpse, a ghost of the proud and intelligent man who had descended into the pit more than a decade earlier. Ballieu never spoke publicly about his experience in the oubliette, but servants reported that he screamed in his sleep every night until his death, reliving horrors that he could neither forget nor adequately describe to others. The physical transformation that Cardinal Ballieu underwent during his 11 years in the oubliette was so complete that even his closest friends initially refused to believe that the emaciated figure who emerged from the pit was the same man who had once been one of the most powerful and influential figures in the French court. Ballieu had entered the oubliette as a robust man in his 40s, with the confident bearing and sophisticated demeanor that befitted his high ecclesiastical office. The creature that was eventually pulled from the depths bore no resemblance to this former self, appearing more like an ancient hermit who had spent decades in ascetic isolation than a former cardinal who had once dined with kings and negotiated with popes. The psychological damage inflicted on Ballieu was even more profound than his physical deterioration. The man who had once been renowned for his eloquence and political cunning could no longer engage in complex conversations or follow logical arguments for more than a few minutes at a time. His memory appeared to have been selectively damaged, with clear recollections of events from his distant past, but complete inability to remember recent occurrences or form new memories effectively. Most disturbing of all was his apparent loss of the capacity for normal human emotions. Ballieu showed no joy at his release, no anger at his treatment, and no apparent interest in resuming any aspect of his former life. The nightmares that plagued Ballieu for the remaining 7 years of his life provided the only glimpse into what he had experienced during his imprisonment in the oubliette. Servants who heard his nightly screaming reported that he seemed to be reliving conversations and experiences that occurred in absolute darkness, speaking to invisible companions and pleading for mercy from tormentors who existed only in his memory. The content of these nightmare monologues suggested that Ballieu's experience in the oubliette had involved not just physical deprivation, but psychological torments that went beyond anything that mere isolation and starvation could explain. The tradition of the oubliette continued under Louis's successors, each king finding the well to be a convenient solution to their own political problems. Charles VIII used it to dispose of 3 Breton nobles who had opposed his marriage to Anne of Brittany. Louis XIV threw in a Venetian ambassador who had been caught spying on French military preparations. Francis I, despite his reputation as a Renaissance humanist, consigned at least 6 people to the pit during his reign, including his own cousin who had questioned the legitimacy of one of the king's military campaigns. Each monarch discovered that once you begin solving problems by making people disappear, it becomes increasingly difficult to solve problems any other way. The institutional knowledge of how to use the oubliette effectively was passed down through the royal household like any other aspect of statecraft, with each new king being briefed on the facility's capabilities and the procedures for making people disappear without political consequences. The maintenance staff responsible for the oubliette developed their own traditions and protocols, including specialized equipment for lowering unconscious victims into the pit and techniques for managing the psychological effects that prolonged exposure to the screams and pleas of prisoners had on the guards and executioners who supervised the facility. Charles VIII's use of the oubliette to eliminate Breton opposition to his marriage to Anne of Brittany demonstrated how the facility had evolved from a tool of personal revenge into an instrument of dynastic policy. The three Breton nobles who disappeared had been leading figures in the resistance to French control over Brittany, and their elimination was essential to Charles's plan to peacefully integrate the duchy into the French kingdom through his marriage to its heiress. The disappearances were timed to coincide with a supposed epidemic of fever that provided cover for multiple deaths among the Breton nobility, while the political chaos, caused by the sudden loss of leadership, made it easier for Charles to impose French administrative control over the region. Louis de Maison's disposal of the Venetian ambassador represented the Oubliette's use as a tool of international diplomacy, demonstrating how inconvenient foreign representatives could be eliminated without creating the diplomatic incidents that would result from more conventional forms of assassination. The ambassador had been caught using his diplomatic immunity to gather intelligence about French naval preparations for campaigns in Italy, information that could have been used by Venice's allies to counter French military strategies. By making the ambassador disappear without trace, Louis XIV avoided the need to formally accuse Venice of espionage while ensuring that the intelligence-gathering operation was permanently terminated. The well claimed its most famous victim in 1574, when Henri III ordered the imprisonment of his own brother, the Duke of Alençon, after discovering a plot to overthrow him and claim the throne. Alençon was not thrown directly into the Oubliette, but was imprisoned in a cell above it, where he could hear the sounds rising from the depths and understand what fate awaited him if he continued to resist his brother's will. The psychological torture was exquisite. Alençon spent months listening to the voices of those already condemned, hearing their prayers turn to curses and their hopes crumble into madness. When he finally submitted completely to his brother's authority, swearing oaths of loyalty that everyone knew were worthless, Henri decided that the lesson had been learned and transferred his brother to more conventional quarters. The case of the Duke of Alençon illustrates how the oubliette could be used as a tool of psychological coercion without necessarily claiming another victim, demonstrating the sophistication with which later monarchs had learned to deploy this instrument of terror. Henri III understood that actually killing his brother would create political complications and potentially trigger a succession crisis, but he also recognized that Alençon's ambitions posed a continuing threat to royal authority that required decisive action. The solution was to expose Alençon to the horrors of the oubliette without actually consigning him to its depths, using the psychological pressure of proximity to the pit to break his will and ensure his future compliance. The psychological effect of hearing the voices from the oubliette was so devastating that it effectively ended Alençon's political ambitions and transformed him from a potential usurper into a broken man who spent the rest of his life in fearful submission to his brother's authority. The months that Alençon spent listening to the sounds of torture and death rising from below destroyed his capacity for political courage and left him with an overwhelming terror of challenging royal authority in any form. His complete capitulation to Henri III's demands demonstrated the effectiveness of the oubliette as a tool of political control, even when it was not used to its full lethal potential. But Alençon's experience in proximity to the oubliette had changed him fundamentally. Courtiers noticed that he never again spoke above a whisper, as if afraid that raising his voice might somehow attract the attention of whatever lived in the darkness below. He developed an obsessive fear of wells, cellars, and any enclosed space that reminded him of his months spent listening to the sounds of human despair. When he died in 1584, supposedly of a fever, many suspected that he had simply lost the will to live, unable to continue existing in a world where he knew such horrors were possible and where his own brother was capable of inflicting them. The long-term psychological effects of Alençon's exposure to the oubliette's horrors extended far beyond his obvious symptoms of trauma and fear. Court physicians noted that he developed a variety of physical ailments that seemed to have no organic cause, including chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and a nervous condition that caused his hands to shake uncontrollably whenever he was stressed or frightened. More significantly, Alençon appeared to have lost his capacity for normal human relationships, becoming unable to trust anyone or form meaningful emotional connections with family members or courtiers who had once been his close friends and allies. The manner of Alençon's death in 1584 remained mysterious and controversial. with some contemporary observers suggesting that he had been poisoned, while others believed that he had taken his own life rather than continue living with the psychological wounds inflicted by his experience near the Oubliette. The official cause of death was listed as fever, but the symptoms described by his physicians were inconsistent with any known disease, and the rapid progression of his final illness suggested either deliberate poisoning or a psychological collapse so complete that his body simply gave up the struggle to continue living. The Château de Vincennes was eventually abandoned as a royal residence, but the Oubliette remained sealed and forgotten until that fateful day in 1934 when restoration workers stumbled upon it. The sounds they heard emerging from the depths defied rational explanation. Acoustic experts who examined the site concluded that the limestone walls could not possibly preserve human voices for centuries, yet electronic recording equipment clearly captured what sounded like multiple people speaking in archaic French, Latin, and other languages that linguistic experts identified as various medieval dialects that had not been spoken for hundreds of years. The discovery of the Oubliette in 1934 occurred during a period of renewed interest in French historical heritage, as the government of the Third Republic sought to promote national unity through celebration of the country's royal and cultural legacy. The restoration of Vincennes was part of a larger program to preserve and showcase France's medieval monuments, but the workers and administrators involved in the project were completely unprepared for the supernatural phenomena they encountered when they opened the sealed chamber. The initial reaction was to assume that the sounds were caused by some natural phenomenon related to underground water flow or structural settling, but attempts to find rational explanations quickly proved inadequate. The linguistic analysis of the voices captured on early recording equipment provided some of the most compelling evidence for the supernatural nature of the phenomena at Vincennes. The recordings clearly contained speech in several different languages and dialects, including forms of medieval French that had not been spoken since the 15th century, ecclesiastical Latin with pronunciation patterns that were characteristic of specific historical periods, and what appeared to be regional dialects from various parts of medieval Europe. The precision and authenticity of these linguistic features were far beyond what any contemporary person could have faked, even with extensive historical knowledge and training. Dr. Marcel Dubois, the archaeologist who led the initial investigation of the site, descended into the Oubliette in 1935 with a team of assistants and sophisticated recording equipment. What they found at the bottom was a charnel house that bore witness to centuries of slow death and unimaginable suffering. Human bones were scattered across the floor in patterns that suggested the prisoners had tried to arrange the remains of their predecessors in some sort of meaningful order, possibly as a way of maintaining their sanity by creating purpose where none existed. Carved into the walls were hundreds of marks, scratches made by fingernails and improvised tools, forming a record of desperation that was more moving than any written history. The bone arrangements discovered at the bottom of the Oubliette provided disturbing insight into the psychological coping mechanisms that prisoners had developed during their final days and weeks of life. The careful positioning of skeletal remains suggested that successive generations of prisoners had created informal burial rituals and memorial practices, treating the bones of their predecessors with a reverence that reflected their own hopes for dignified treatment after death. Some bones had been arranged in religious symbols or geometric patterns that appeared to have spiritual significance, while others had been organized according to apparent anatomical knowledge that suggested some prisoners had possessed medical or scholarly training. The wall carvings discovered by Dr. Dubois' team represented a form of historical documentation that was both heartbreaking and invaluable for understanding the experience of Oubliette prisoners. Many of the scratches formed recognizable letters and words, creating a palimpsest of final messages, prayers, and desperate communications that spanned several centuries of imprisonment. Some prisoners had attempted to keep calendars by marking the passage of days, while others had carved religious symbols or personal names that served as final testaments to their existence. The overlay of different carving styles and the evidence of multiple generations of prisoners adding to the wall inscriptions created an archaeological record of suffering that was unique in medieval European history. But it was the sounds that continued to emerge from the Oubliette that truly disturbed the investigators. Even with no living prisoners in the chamber, the acoustic properties of the well continued to produce what could only be described as human voices. Some scientists theorized that the limestone walls had somehow recorded the sounds of centuries of suffering and were playing them back like some sort of geological phonograph. Others suggested that the unique acoustic properties of the chamber were creating auditory hallucinations in those who listened too carefully to the sounds of wind and settling stone. But none of these explanations satisfied those who had actually heard the voices with their own ears. The geological phonograph theory proposed by some scientists was based on the idea that limestone, under certain conditions of pressure and mineral composition, could theoretically record and replay sound waves in much the same way that early phonograph cylinders preserved audio information. Proponents of this theory pointed to documented cases of unusual acoustic phenomena in limestone caves and suggested that the unique construction of the oubliette might have created conditions favorable to this type of natural sound recording. However, the theory failed to explain why the sounds were so clearly identifiable as human speech, or why they seemed to respond to contemporary events and the presence of modern investigators. The auditory hallucination hypothesis was favored by psychologists and medical experts who argued that the combination of suggestion, expectation, and the unique acoustic environment of the oubliette could create false perceptions of human speech in susceptible individuals. According to this theory, investigators who approached the site with knowledge of its history and expectations of supernatural phenomena would be psychologically primed to interpret random sounds as meaningful speech, especially in an environment where echoes and acoustic distortions made it difficult to accurately identify the sources and characteristics of sounds. However, this explanation was challenged by the consistency of reports from multiple independent witnesses and the specific linguistic content of the recorded voices. The French government sealed the oubliette again in 1936, officially declaring it a historical monument that was too dangerous for public access. But the decision was motivated as much by superstition as by safety concerns. Too many of the workers and researchers who had investigated the site reported nightmares, auditory hallucinations, and an overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Dr. Dubois himself suffered a nervous breakdown and spent the last years of his life in a psychiatric hospital, claiming that he could still hear the voices from the oubliette, even when he was hundreds of miles away from Vincennes. The decision to reseal the oubliette reflected the French government's recognition that the site posed psychological and possibly supernatural threats that could not be adequately contained or explained through conventional means. The official justification focused on structural safety concerns and the need to preserve the historical integrity of the site, but internal government documents revealed that officials were primarily concerned about the psychological effects on staff and researchers who had been exposed to the phenomena. The pattern of mental health problems among those who had worked at the site was impossible to ignore, and medical experts could provide no adequate explanation for the specific symptoms that affected oubliette investigators. Dr. Marcel Dubois' breakdown was particularly disturbing because of his previous reputation for psychological stability and scientific objectivity. Dubois had built his career on the careful investigation of historical sites throughout France and had never previously shown any signs of mental instability or susceptibility to supernatural beliefs. His colleagues noted that his personality began to change within weeks of his first descent into the oubliette, as he became increasingly withdrawn, paranoid, and obsessed with the voices he claimed to hear. The fact that a respected scientist could be so profoundly affected by his experience at Vincennes raised serious questions about the nature of the phenomena and their potential effects on future investigators. The specific symptoms reported by Dr. Dubois and other oubliette investigators included persistent auditory hallucinations, chronic insomnia, severe anxiety, and what psychiatrists described as temporal displacement syndrome, a condition in which patients seemed to believe they were living in different historical periods and would speak as if they were medieval prisoners awaiting execution. These symptoms were consistent across multiple individuals who had no contact with each other, suggesting that exposure to the oubliette environment produced specific and predictable psychological effects that went beyond normal stress reactions or suggestion-based phenomena. During World War II, the German occupation forces considered using the chateau as a prison for resistance fighters, but abandoned the plan after several Nazi officers reported hearing unexplained sounds coming from the sealed well. Local resistance members later claimed that the voices from the Oubliette had actually helped them by frightening away German patrols who were supposed to be guarding the building. Whether this was true or merely the sort of legend that grows around places where too much blood has been spilled, it added another layer to the mythology surrounding the cursed well. The German investigation of Vincennes as a potential prison facility represented one of the few documented attempts by foreign authorities to study the Oubliette phenomena. German military engineers conducted a thorough structural survey of the chateau and were initially impressed by the security potential of the medieval fortress, but their enthusiasm quickly waned when they encountered the same acoustic anomalies that had disturbed French investigators. SS officers who were assigned to evaluate the site reported that the unexplained sounds made it impossible to maintain proper security protocols, as guards could not distinguish between supernatural phenomena and actual escape attempts or resistance activity. The resistance claims about the Oubliette's protective effects were supported by documented instances of German patrols abandoning their posts at Vincennes after reporting supernatural encounters. German military records discovered after the war included several incident reports describing soldiers who had fled their guard duties after hearing voices speaking in languages they could not identify and experiencing what they described as attacks by invisible enemies. Whether these incidents represented genuine supernatural phenomena or psychological warfare by French resistance fighters who had learned to exploit the site's reputation, they contributed to the German decision to abandon Vincennes as unsuitable for military use. The psychological impact of the Oubliette on German forces also reflected the universal human vulnerability to the site's phenomena, demonstrating that the effects were not limited to people with specific cultural or linguistic backgrounds. German soldiers, who had been trained to ignore local superstitions and focus on military objectives, proved just as susceptible to the psychological effects of exposure to the Oubliette as French investigators and workers had been. This universality of response suggested that the phenomena were not culturally specific, but represented something more fundamental about human psychology and its interaction with environments where extreme suffering had occurred. In the 1960s, paranormal investigators gained permission to study the site using modern acoustic equipment and recording devices. Their findings were both fascinating and terrifying. The sounds emerging from the Oubliette were not constant, but seemed to follow patterns related to atmospheric pressure, lunar cycles, and other environmental factors that nobody could adequately explain. During certain weather conditions, particularly before storms, the voices became almost deafening, as if the approaching barometric changes were somehow amplifying whatever forces were at work in the depths of the well. Recordings made during these periods clearly captured what sounded like dozens of people speaking simultaneously in various languages, creating a cacophony of despair that was almost unbearable to hear. The systematic study of the Oubliette phenomena during the 1960s represented the first truly scientific approach to understanding the supernatural activity at Vincennes. The paranormal investigators who conducted this research brought sophisticated equipment and methodological rigor to their work, using techniques borrowed from acoustics, psychology, and emerging fields like parapsychology to document and analyze the phenomena. Their findings challenged conventional understanding of how sound and human consciousness interact, suggesting that the Oubliette environment somehow facilitated forms of communication or preservation that existing scientific knowledge could not adequately explain. The correlation between environmental conditions and the intensity of supernatural activity at the Oubliette provided some of the most compelling evidence for the objective reality of the phenomena. The investigators documented clear patterns showing that voice activity increased significantly during periods of low atmospheric pressure, reached peak intensity during the new moon phase of the lunar cycle, and showed seasonal variations that correlated with temperature and humidity changes. These patterns were consistent across multiple years of observation and could not be explained as coincidental or as artifacts of the recording equipment. The barometric pressure correlations were particularly intriguing because they suggested that the Oubliette phenomena might be influenced by physical forces that affected the entire atmospheric system. Meteorologists who studied the data noted that the pressure changes that preceded the most intense voice activity were often associated with approaching storm systems, leading some researchers to theorize that electromagnetic disturbances in the atmosphere might somehow interact with whatever preserved or generated the supernatural sounds. This theory gained support from the observation that voice activity also increased during periods of high solar activity and geomagnetic disturbances. The most disturbing discovery came when researchers compared their modern recordings with historical documents from the archives of Vincennes. Some of the voices captured on tape seemed to be reciting prayers, complaints, and personal details that matched perfectly with known facts about specific individuals who had been imprisoned in the Oubliette centuries earlier. Cardinal Ballou's voice was apparently among those recorded, reciting Latin prayers in a distinctive accent that matched descriptions of his speech patterns found in contemporary court records. If the recordings were accurate, it suggested that somehow the Oubliette was not just echoing sounds from the past, but preserving the actual voices of people who had died there centuries ago. The identification of specific historical voices in the modern recordings represented a breakthrough in understanding the nature of the Oubliette phenomena. But it also raised disturbing questions about the relationship between consciousness, death, and physical environment. The voice patterns attributed to Cardinal Ballou were analyzed by linguistic experts who confirmed that the accent, pronunciation, and vocabulary were consistent with educated French speech from the late 15th century, including specific regional characteristics that matched Ballou's documented origins in Normandy. The precision of these linguistic details was far beyond what any modern person could have faked, even with extensive historical training. The content of the prayers and statements attributed to historical figures provided even more compelling evidence for the authenticity of the recordings. The Latin prayers, spoken by the voice identified as Cardinal Ballou, included specific variations and personal additions that matched entries in Ballou's surviving prayer books and theological writings. Similarly, voices attributed to other historical prisoners recited personal information, family names, and details about their lives that were accurate according to historical records, but were not widely known even among medieval historians. The level of detail and accuracy in these recordings seemed to rule out the possibility of deliberate fraud or coincidental similarity. The psychological impact of discovering that actual historical voices might be preserved in the Oubliette was profound for the researchers involved in the 1960s investigations. Several team members reported nightmares and anxiety attacks after listening to recordings of people who had been dead for centuries, but who seemed to be speaking as if their imprisonment and torture was still ongoing. The immediacy and emotional intensity of the voices created a sense of temporal displacement that made it difficult for researchers to maintain their objectivity and psychological distance from the historical events they were studying. Modern visitors to the Château de Vincennes can tour the building and learn about its role in French history, but the Oubliette remains sealed and off-limits to the public. Official guides mention it only briefly, describing it as a medieval prison that has been closed for safety reasons. They do not mention the sounds, the recordings, or the dozens of researchers and workers who have reported supernatural experiences at the site. The French government continues to maintain that the voices are merely acoustic phenomena caused by wind and structural settling, but they have never offered a satisfactory scientific explanation for recordings that clearly capture human speech in dead languages. The official policy of minimizing discussion of the Oubliette phenomena reflects the French government's ongoing concern about the psychological and social effects of publicizing supernatural activity at a major historical site. Tourism officials worry that sensationalized accounts of ghostly voices could either attract unwanted attention from sensation seekers and paranormal enthusiasts, or could discourage normal tourist visits to an important cultural heritage site. The decision to maintain public silence about the recordings and research findings represents a compromise between the scientific value of studying the phenomena and the practical need to manage public perception of the site. The scientific community's response to the Oubliette research has been divided between those who accept the evidence for genuine supernatural phenomena and those who continue to search for conventional explanations. Mainstream acoustics experts have proposed various theories involving underground water flow, structural resonance, and infrasonic effects that might create the illusion of human speech, but none of these theories adequately explain the specific linguistic content and historical accuracy of the recorded voices. Parapsychologists and consciousness researchers have embraced the Oubliette findings as evidence for their theories about environmental recording of traumatic events and the survival of consciousness after death. The ongoing academic debate about the Oubliette phenomena has been complicated by the French government's classification of much of the research data and their restriction of access to the site. Independent verification of the findings has been difficult because of these security measures, leading some skeptics to suggest that the entire phenomenon might be an elaborate hoax or misinterpretation of natural acoustic effects. However, the consistency of reports from multiple independent researchers over several decades, combined with the sophisticated nature of the linguistic evidence, has convinced many experts that some form of genuine anomalous activity is occurring at the site. The classification of Oubliette research data by the French government extends beyond simple tourist management concerns to include national security considerations related to the potential psychological and social effects of confirming supernatural phenomena at a state-owned historical site. Government officials worry that official acknowledgement of ghostly voices could undermine public confidence in rational governance and scientific authority, while also potentially inspiring copycat claims at other historical sites throughout France. The decision to maintain official skepticism while continuing classified research represents an attempt to balance scientific investigation with social stability. Today, the Oubliette of Vincennes stands as a monument to the cruelty that absolute power can inspire, and the way that some forms of evil leave permanent scars on the places where they are committed. Whether the voices are supernatural phenomena, acoustic anomalies, or psychological projections created by our knowledge of the horrors that occurred there, they serve as a reminder that some acts of cruelty are so profound that they echo through the centuries, refusing to be forgotten even when those who committed them have long since turned to dust. The well that was designed to make people disappear from history has instead become a place where the voices of the forgotten refuse to be silenced, crying out from the darkness for justice that will never come and recognition that arrives centuries too late to matter to anyone, except those who still have ears to hear their eternal lament. The philosophical implications of the Oubliette phenomena extend far beyond the specific question of whether supernatural activity is occurring at Vincennes. The site raises fundamental questions about the relationship between human consciousness and physical environment, the nature of memory and historical preservation, and the moral responsibility that living generations bear for the crimes of their predecessors. The voices from the Oubliette, whether real or perceived, serve as a form of historical witness that refuses to be silenced by time or official denial, demanding recognition and remembrance for those whose suffering was deliberately hidden from historical record. The concept of environmental memory suggested by the Oubliette phenomena challenges conventional understanding of how traumatic events are preserved and transmitted across generations. If the voices are indeed some form of recorded consciousness or environmental preservation of human experience, they represent a form of historical documentation that is more immediate and emotionally powerful than any written record or archaeological artifact. The possibility that extreme human suffering can somehow imprint itself on physical locations raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between mind and matter, and the mechanisms by which historical trauma affects subsequent generations. The continuing activity at the Oubliette also serves as a reminder that historical injustices often have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victims and perpetrators. The voices that emerge from the depths of the well represent not just individual suffering, but the accumulated weight of systematic cruelty and abuse of power that characterized medieval royal justice. Each voice is both a specific person with a unique story of suffering and a symbol of the countless others who disappeared into similar instruments of torture throughout European history. Their stories lost to historical amnesia, but their pain somehow preserved in the stones that witnessed their deaths. The modern response to the Oubliette phenomena reflects contemporary society's uncomfortable relationship with historical violence and its legacy in the present day. The official policy of denial and minimization represents a desire to distance ourselves from the cruelties of the past and to maintain faith in human progress and the possibility of rational governance. But the persistence of the voices, regardless of their ultimate nature, challenges this comfortable narrative by insisting that some historical wounds do not heal, and that some forms of injustice create consequences that transcend the normal boundaries of time and causation. The Oubliette of Vincennes ultimately stands as a test of our willingness to confront the darkest aspects of human history and to acknowledge the reality of suffering that we would prefer to forget. Whether the voices are supernatural phenomena or psychological projections, they demand recognition for those who are deliberately erased from historical memory and challenge us to consider what obligations we bear to remember and honor the victims of systematic cruelty. The well that was designed to make people disappear has instead become a monument to the indestructibility of human dignity and the power of suffering to transcend death itself, ensuring that the voices of the forgotten will continue to echo through the centuries until their stories are finally heard and their pain is finally acknowledged by those who have the power to remember. The legacy of the Oubliette extends beyond the specific site at Vincennes to encompass all places where human beings have been subjected to systematic cruelty and deliberate erasure from historical memory. The voices that rise from the depths of the well speak not only for those who died in that particular chamber, but for all victims of political persecution, religious intolerance, and abuse of power throughout human history. Their eternal lament serves as both a warning about the capacity for evil that exists within human institutions and a testament to the resilience of human dignity in the face of ultimate degradation. The story of the Oubliette of Vincennes reminds us that some places on Earth bear witness to events so terrible that they transcend normal historical documentation and enter the realm of eternal memory. Whether preserved by supernatural forces or by the power of human consciousness to recognize and respond to extreme suffering, these sites serve as permanent memorials to injustice and repositories of moral obligation for living generations. The voices that echo from the depths of the cursed well will continue to cry out for recognition and remembrance until their stories become part of our collective historical consciousness and their suffering is finally acknowledged as a permanent part of human experience that can never be forgotten or erased by official denial or the passage of time. The Oubliette was meant to silence its victims forever. Instead, their agony echoes on, defying time, science, and reason. From royal betrayal to whispered Latin prayers recorded in the modern age, the screams from Vincennes remind us that history doesn't stay buried. It calls out, waiting to be heard. If this story left you shaken, comment your thoughts below. Like to honor the forgotten and subscribe for more stories where the past refuses to stay dead.